My name is Lisa McIntyre Shaw. I am the Vice Chair of Programming for the Global Interdependence Center and the founding partner of Cygnus Asset Management. It is my privilege and honor to know many of you already, and it will be my happy day to know you better at the end of today. The Global Interdependence Center members are here. Some of them have, what'd you call this? Ribbons. Thank you. Have ribbons on that say members. So if you're interested at all in this type of content and these types of programs, please see someone who is a member, because it is a very low cost program to become a member of, and it is a plethora of knowledge in all kinds of modes, whether it be video or decks or just written information. So my job is to keep us all on time, and it is my privilege to introduce our next group, which is David Altig from the Atlanta Federal Reserve. He's the Director of Research there, and he will be moderated or conversing, fireside chatting with Michael McKee, who is the International Economics and Policy Correspondent at Bloomberg. A longtime GIC, both of these gentlemen are actually longtime GIC supporters. I haven't fished with Dave, but I've fished with Mike. And again, thank you, especially to AIG for their generous support, and thank you all for attending. You've got it. And by the way, David's going to talk about the R word and the I word and those kinds of things.
Thank you. R word. We'll leave the stars out, and that might make things work a little bit more easily. David is, of course, a Federal Reserve official, so there are some things he can and can't talk about. We do know there's some controversial stuff going on right now, some weird stuff going on right now, in which a lot of money is at stake. So I guess I have to ask you first, Braves or Phillies? Braves. It's hometown bias. This is an interesting situation because we're here at a conference on ESG, but the Fed really doesn't do a lot of S&G. Where you are heavily involved is the E, environmental work, but you're not judging the environment or the investment standards. You're looking underneath the hood. Can you tell us something about what the Fed's involvement is in the E part of ESG?
Yeah, so I think I have a presentation. Are we ready to roll with it?
Click.
Oh, I click?
No, I'm sorry. Can you click through, please? I'm sorry, they're out of
click.
order.
There we go. Yeah, so some of you may be asking, why am I not back at my desk working on that inflation thing? So you will not have been the first person to ask that question, I guarantee that. So I have two answers to that. One is, we're working on it. We'll get there. The second is that I do want to spend the time, my time here this morning, convincing you that our efforts as they pertain to the E and ESG, climate change in particular, are very, very definitely on mission for the Fed and part of what we view as pursuing our mandate, our congressionally mandated objectives. So there is a pretty clear statement. I'm not flying blind here. By the way, let me back up one step. There's a disclaimer there, which says that the views that I express are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System, and I really, 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 really mean it. So take it for what it's worth, but I am not going to kind of go off the reservation too much here. There is a statement that was really released last year about the role of the Federal Reserve in climate change economics and climate change issues. We are committed, so said the statement, to working within our existing mandates and authorities to address the implications of climate change, particularly the regulation and supervision of financial institutions and the stability of the broader financial system. So the first sort of entry point has to do with our supervisory responsibilities for financial institutions, banks in particular, and our financial stability concerns. Now this really contrasts us with, for example, the European Central Bank, which has a much more expansive set of responsibilities as it relates to climate change, which really amount to basically sorts of credit policies. So both in terms of the portfolio they hold, the types of assets they buy, and in the way that they implement their supervisory responsibilities with respect to valuing collateral, for example, and appropriate haircuts to particular types of collateral. They're very, very active in a direct way in the climate change issues. And in fact, they have a scoring system. So this is actually a quote from the ECB from this summer. And their scoring system to decide what to buy and what haircuts to apply to collateral is based upon sort of some three-pronged criteria that involve backward-looking emissions records for particular companies, forward-looking emissions criteria, and then actually a G part of the ESG in terms of disclosures and governance and those sorts of things. We've got nothing like that. Our governance for the stuff we buy is actually the federal government. So we don't weigh in on that. You can feel about that how you want to, but this is well outside of our mandate. Now, just because we don't directly involve our credit policies in climate change issues, it is a little bit broader than that financial stability supervisory set of responsibilities that I noted in the first slide. So I think I took this directly off the San Francisco Fed website, and I think literally the page is titled, Why We Care About Climate Change. So they list a bunch of things, supervision for sure, but also research, also community, also operations. And if you are familiar with the Fed at all, you know, basically they've now defined climate as being relevant to what sometimes we call this the four-legged stool. We are involved in banking supervision and regulation. We are involved in research related to that, as well as monetary policy issues. We are involved in community development questions, particularly as they pertain to low and moderate income populations. And of course, we run a bunch of operations. We move cash around, we run wires, we do all sorts of things. So I want to just sort of briefly talk about what is happening in sort of the climate area, or how at least I think about our activities as they relate to climate economics and climate policy in each one of these buckets. And again, I'm going to rely very heavily on sort of stuff that is actually going on in the Federal Reserve, and not my particular view of this is completely irrelevant. So the supervision part, as noted at the outset, is sort of the very direct one. And in fact, there was a fairly significant announcement last week that the Federal Reserve Board, which is the governing body for bank supervision and regulation, is going to introduce next year a pilot project to assess climate exposure for very, very large banks. So that's the language is there. The Federal Reserve Board announced that 6 of the nation's largest banks will participate in the pilot climate scenario analysis exercise designed to enhance the ability of supervisors and firms to measure and manage climate-related financial risks. And that's expected to be completed next year. There's a couple important details about that. One is there are no supervisory implications directly from this pilot. It is a pilot to see how this might work, what the methodology might look like to engage in such stress testing, if you will, and no firm-specific information will be released. So you should think of this as very definitely an experiment that is not necessarily designed to implement capital requirements, at least not at this point. Because this is a pretty complicated process, and basically in some of my subsequent remarks here, I'm going to kind of concede to some of that complication, which takes us to why we're doing the research piece of it. So I'm the research director, so this is my favorite part of the whole business, and we obviously don't just research monetary policy issues or financial market issues. We spend an awful lot of time on real economy sorts of queries. We need to know what's happening with productivity, we need to know what's happening with labor markets, we need to know what's happening with economic growth. These are central to getting monetary policy right. The stars are right in the middle of all that. So there is a lot of research going on in the Federal Reserve System about the potential economic consequences of climate change. So I've showed a picture here, which is from a fairly influential paper by Solomon Shang, who I think is at Berkeley, runs the Global Policy Institute or something like that. Solomon Shang and like a dozen other co-authors from all sorts of different disciplines, projecting forward the economic cost of climate change. So along the horizontal axis is changes from the baseline temperature going forward. On the vertical axis is the annualized cost in terms of GDP from temperature change for the period from 2080 to 2099. So this is very forward-looking stuff, and you can see the numbers there. The red indicators that I've shown are basically the ICPP climate scenarios, the ones that are associated with what if we do nothing, what will happen. And you can see the temperature change is sort of in the range of 3 to 4. The GDP cost is sort of in the range of 2 to 3 percentage points annually. If you put that in 2020 dollars, that's roughly $500 billion per year lost due to that measure of temperature change. And if you need a reference point for that, that's roughly the same as all of the funds that we spend annually on non-medical related or non-healthcare related expenditures on low income, for low-income individuals, transfers. So SNAP, all sorts of housing assistance, child care assistance, all that sort of stuff. So what would this cost us annually? Doing nothing, it would cost us basically everything we spend to support sort of the lower part of the income distribution in the country. And that's if it doesn't get worse and gets fixed after that. Because one of the things you clearly see about this estimate is it's not linear. The cost increase in the amount of climate change. On average, it's something like for every percentage, or every 1 degree of temperature increase, it costs 1.2 percentage points on growth, or 1.2% on the level of growth, but that's average. And it is not, as I said, linear. It's rising in the incapacity to actually hold back this temperature change. So obviously, these sort of growth implications are of central concern to us in the central bank as we think about what the environment will look like, the economic environment will look like for us going forward as we go about trying to reach the mandates of stable prices and maximum employment. The second thing to note is that, and this is also from that Shang study, the geographic effects are quite dispersed and diverse. So in this is a county by county map of the estimates of the climate change costs for the local economies in the United States. So this is the general rule of graphs like this: red, bad; green, good. So the interesting thing about this is there is a very, very significant redistribution of income that is predicted to be brought about by climate change. And so I live down there in the lower right-hand part of that picture. The Atlanta Fed, in case you don't know, our territory is basically eastern Tennessee, all of Georgia, all of Florida, all of Alabama, southern Mississippi, and southern Louisiana, or as we like to call it, or don't like to call it, ground zero for economic problems. One of our strategic priorities at the Atlanta Fed is to advance economic mobility and resilience. If you're looking for a place where there is not economic mobility and resilience, you look where I live. And what this map is very clearly indicating is that the effects of climate change are going to affect negatively where I live. In the Northwest, there are positive effects. So for the economy as a whole, as the previous pictures show, the effect is negative, but it's not going to be negative for everyone. And there is a substantial redistribution of income, and that redistribution of income, as predicted in the event here, is going to fall disproportionately on the least capable of absorbing it in the country. So I put community, the interest we have in our community, low and moderate income responsibilities at the Fed, and climate change is very, very definitely expected to impact on that. This is a long answer to your question. So sort of back then to what we're doing in all these areas, or what we have to deal with as we kind of tackle these elements of climate change that impinge upon sort of all of our mission and the activities related to our mission. There's a whole lot of questions that obviously have to be answered. So when we think about banking supervision, I mean, it's not, we can take on what the direct costs are associated with climate-related issues. So by that I mean, look, I own a mortgage on a property that is sitting on the coast of Florida. And if that goes, big storm comes through, or there's erosion, or there's some problem climate-related, I'm going to say climate-related. I'm not going to try to get too fine about the distinction between weather and climate. In some sense, to us, it doesn't matter all that much. But if there is some issue with that, then the portfolio is obviously at risk, and there has to be some sort of way to manage that risk on a financial institution's portfolio. But then there's also all these indirect risks that have to do with sort of the general economic climate, the collateral impact on the economy as a whole, local economy, importantly, as I showed in that last chart, associated with climate change developments. So once you so that's pretty hard, figuring out what those things are. And then you've got to figure your way through all of the potential mitigants to that risk. That involves equity, obviously. It involves capital buffers against these risks. It involves insurance. So you have to assess sort of both the value of explicit insurance and implicit insurance. That comes through the public sector. So the public sector insurance schemes are often explicit, but they're also often implicit. So how you discount that or factor that in is actually a pretty daunting sort of question. So all this stuff has to sort of be sorted out and work together. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, is actually front and center on working with regulatory entities and central banks throughout the world, and have sort of identified a checklist of things you have to do to get this right. So you have to identify physical and transition risk scenarios, link those scenarios to financial risks, assess counterparty and/or sector sensitivities to the financial risks, and extrapolate the impact of the sensitivity, calculate an aggregate measure of exposure and loss. It's a lot of stuff you got to do. And then you got to sort of figure out how you're going to implement that checklist. So there's a couple things going on. One, at the simplest level, there's just what they call exposure mapping. You just kind of go down that list and you identify what all of the physical risks might be, sort of how do they map into the financial institutions broadly and all that. But obviously there's more high touch sort of or intensive analysis going on. One of them, we're talking about the Fed, as I showed you sort of earlier on, stress testing. A subset of scenario analysis typically used to evaluate near-term resiliency to economic shocks through a capital adequacy target. Sensitivity analysis then is, okay, now if I start playing around with things like policy, how does all of that change? And according to this survey from the BIS, survey of 19 sort of major central banks, essentially every single bank but one is doing some form of this exposure mapping. A little bit less universal effort on stress testing or scenario planning, different sorts of time frames for thinking about this analysis. One is what the BIS calls transition planning, which is I got a portfolio now and I want to assess sort of what happens in that portfolio under these different scenarios or under these different stress scenarios. And then the other is what they call physical analysis, I think, which is essentially, okay, now let's think about those long-term trends and where this is going to end up. In terms of thinking about the entire financial landscape as we go forward, and what do we do about it? This is obviously an incredible forecasting exercise, and to highlight that we are talking about forecast, this is a picture from William Nordhaus's Nobel Prize lecture. Nordhaus is very much an advocate of addressing climate change forthrightly and quickly. But this picture sort of shows you sort of what we're up against. So the blue line there is the variation over 400,000 years in temperature, global temperature as measured by the Antarctic ice core. All right, so if you look at that just the blue stuff on that picture, can you pick out today versus sometime in the past? It's not so easy. So why we're worried is the red stuff there, which is all model-based forecasts. Getting that right is absolutely essential. And getting that right is the enormously complicated task. It involves not just climate risk, but also, obviously, the risk of temperature change, but all of the things that go into measuring the economic consequences of that temperature change. So again, I'm going back to the Shang paper, so that's a little bit hard to read, but so that paper, which was published in 2017, is really a good, it's really an interesting paper. And as I said, it was a interdisciplinary team that did it, and they were looking really at all-in cost. So they're looking at the costs associated with agricultural yields, mortality changes, which are obviously a bit complicated by the fact that when you raise temperature, you reduce mortality from cold. At the same time, you're increasing mortality from heat, and that itself is a complication. Energy expenditures, risks to labor, coastal damage, property crime, violent crime, all of these things go into the analysis of what the economic costs are of climate change and temperature rises in particular in this paper. So you need basically expertise from almost any area you can think of to even have any hope of getting this right. So I'll close by just noting that answering those questions, trying to get our arms around just the animal we're dealing with, is a very, very active activity within the Federal Reserve. It involves, so I've listed a bunch of papers here. As I said, they don't even, it's just, I can just sort of randomly put down some stuff I knew about. The authors of these things include people from our supervision and regulation units. It involves people from our economic research units. It involves colleagues from our community development, and they cover agriculture to financial stability to flood probabilities, how the impact of climate change is likely to play out for low-income populations versus high-income populations. We're sort of working on all of these fronts, and of course rabid consumers of the literature associated with all those things as well, and so that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Well, that was a nice, something about to take that. So,
we can share this one, I guess. I'm curious how this is all being put together at the Fed, because obviously the Atlanta Fed, as you noted, a strong presence in Hurricane Alley, but the Louis Fed would be worried about tornadoes, blizzards for the Boston Fed. Is this a Fed-wide thing, or is each bank working on it? Who's going to come up with the central core principles?
So both. So there are agendas that each of the Federal Reserve banks and the Board of Governors are pursuing, particularly on the research front. But we very actively share and coordinate on that work. So I don't think I'm revealing anything bad. I never really know. But so, for example, we had a long meeting. It was a whole afternoon of individuals across the system who are doing a lot of this work. And that group meets regularly, probably every month or couple of weeks. There's a Teams channel that we share information on. So it actually is it's decentralized the way Fed stuff typically is, but it's actually much more coordinated than a lot of the research that goes on. When it comes to the supervisory stuff directly, of course, that's that's being driven by the Board of Governors, and there's full hands-on, all hands-on deck efforts in that regard.
We've got a few minutes for questions, and Jill has some cards. If you have a question, you can write down. I'll ask a few questions, and we'll turn over to the audience if we can. Hold on just a second. I have one important question to ask David, and that is the scenario analysis. I've got to get the terminology correct because I know this is a sore point with banks. But what does that become? Does it become a stress test, another test for banks to meet down the road? And let me combine this since we're short on time. You're doing the first round of this experiment with the largest banks. But wouldn't it be the smaller banks in smaller communities with smaller risk management staffs that we would need to worry about?
So I'm going to give you a non-answer, quite honestly. So there are no plans beyond the pilot. the board has been very clear about this. This is to, get something up and running and have an experiment so we have a foundation upon which to kind of understand what future actions might be. The point about smaller banks is actually a really good one. The issue with stress testing itself on smaller banks has, of course, been something that's been a work in progress since Dodd-Frank. On the one hand, many of them will be exposed in ways that larger banks may not be, because there isn't the same sort of hedge available for the geographic kind of dispersion in the portfolios. On the other hand, they typically don't pose systemic risk to financial stability, and it's very expensive for them to do it. So is there a way that this could be, something of value like that could be shared in a relatively low cost? I don't know. And I think that's one of the, it's a great question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but it is something that bears watching, because we know that there is going to be, if that one map showed, there's going to be a differential impact by geography, on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis almost.
There's some questions being written down, but there was a gentleman in the back that had a question.
Do you want to ask?
If you could just go ahead. We don't have a lot of time, so just go ahead.
Thank you. I am a climate scientist, and so I love this conversation in a way that maybe few people do. So I apologize for that. But what I wanted to say is some of the maps you showed, they capture some of the risk that we're talking about. Rising temperatures, in my view, are far off from where the cost and the benefits are really going to accumulate, let's say in North America. For example, there's going to be another 12 inches on average of sea level rise by 2050. I'm not talking 2100, I'm talking by 2050. And areas like this are going to experience severe flood issues on a routine basis. And that includes all the way up the East Coast, where you have a lot of green on your map. I don't really think it represents, it might represent temperature issues, but the real issues we have are the climate impacts created by the temperature, and this is sea level rise, more flooding on top of sea level rise, slower moving hurricanes that move further north, and things like this that I don't see in your stress test database.
Yeah, they were actually there. So at least as I'm not a climate scientist, so at least as I understand the analysis, I mean, the temperature is sort of the change, is the catalyst for things like flooding.
It is, the temperature's the catalyst.
And so that, in fact, one of those pictures was coastal flooding. I would certainly imagine, although I would have to go back and look very carefully, that also includes, river, sort of river flooding in various parts of the country as well. That stuff is, there is an attempt, in fact, it's very central to much of the analysis to capture those sorts of things.
Does the Federal Reserve have direct access to climate scientists who are actually advising the Federal Reserve directly? Or is it
Well, first of all, I don't know who exactly is advising the Fed for sure, but we do have access to kind of detailed climate data on a very granular sort of basis. So the answer to that is really yes.
Interesting question here from someone, obviously, who lives south of here, in the dark areas, as you mentioned. You mentioned income distribution, but also population distribution. We're seeing a lot of movement into the Sun Belt, into Florida. Does that speed up the urgency of what you do?
Yeah, I think So now again, I'm conjecturing, but I think maybe in that analysis they held population constant, acknowledging that there's a migration issue which could change the calculus some. For example, if you've got people moving from some of the green areas to some of the red areas, which is the trend and unlikely to be abated anytime soon, then the mortality numbers could change. Maybe they could change substantially. I don't know. I'm not sure that's included in that analysis, but if it's not, eventually it will be. I mean, the number of variables that you've got to continue to kind of be vetting and adding to the analysis grows pretty quickly. I mean, look, here's what we know. I mean, economists and actually even regular people, that there's a lot of endogenous behavioral responses that are just kind of unpredictable. So you would guess that as you began to see kind of a disproportionate impact on the kind of southeast and a disproportionately positive impact on the northwest, that would create some change in migration patterns, which we're not seeing today. But I'm not quite sure that's modeled in those respects.
David, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't have a microphone. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
It's coming. It's not.
Okay.
It is.
We got it.
Don't want you to have to scream.
Sorry, we did that right.
Just a quick follow-up to Mike's question there. We see and think about the Fed in the macro structure which you outlined so well. I looked at your maps of the United States and I was trying to draw the lines of the districts on each of those maps. I started to write a question that it's taken 4 hours to write. You're at the Atlanta Fed. You faced the hurricane. You faced the Katrinas. Bob Eisenweiss has told us at Cumberland what he had to deal with when Katrina hit New Orleans. You have to deal with Ian, multi-billion-dollar risk impacts. Kansas City has to worry about drought. San Francisco is worrying about fires. Take us into the weeds in a district bank and how it goes from the macro to you in Atlanta with hurricane and flooding, with Kansas City with ag and drought, Mary Daly and fires and else. Give us a 3 minutes so we can have a peek into the thing, not at the macro.
Yeah, I don't think it'll take you 3 minutes. So if you actually look down the list of publications like that and then a broader list of publications, you will notice that each district is sort of concentrating on climate effects that are most relevant to their populations in their district. So it is exactly the case that in San Francisco there's a lot of work going on in wildfire. It's exactly the case that in our district, in Richmond, and other places that are in basically the bullseye of hurricanes. That tends to be really important, as well as coastal flooding, which is enormously important in the southeast. Agriculture in Kansas City, and St. Louis, and even Chicago. So the way it's sort of working out, I mean, nobody is guiding this, and nobody is directing this to happen. But through the research efforts at the local banks, they are tend to focus on the local issues for their communities, and that is getting aggregated basically then into sort of the bigger picture of the whole thing through this coordination that we've done, sharing information about the research we're doing.
We are just about out of time, but I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask one more last question to sort of wrap this all up. ESG is about investing, and we've invited all these people here today to hear about investing. And I'm wondering, your route into that is through the banks because you supervise the banks. But if you find problems, how far do you let your regulation go? I'm trying to figure out a good way of saying this. If you tell the banks they have to have this kind of safety, then are they going to be going to their customers and say, and telling them, you got to change your practices and policies? In other words, do you start with a central Fed regulation that then becomes something economy-wide that investors need to take note?
I knew you'd ask a question, I didn't want to answer. So first of all, there is a lot of coordination, interagency discussions happening across all the regulators to figure out exactly how this is going to play out. I will simply say with respect to banking supervision and regulation as it pertains to the Federal Reserve, the standard regulatory approach for us is not to prohibit or direct behaviors. It is to say, look, we've assessed this risk to you, and we are therefore going to kind of ask for this mitigant, typically in the form of a capital buffer. And then it's up to the bank to figure out how they want to respond and whether or not it's in their interest to find an approach that gets companies to mitigate the risk for them. We really try to stay out of that business.
Well, on that note, then, I think the one definitive thing we got is he's going to the Braves this afternoon. Thank Dave Altig from the I'm getting a signal from Jill over there that I should remind you, now it's time for a break. So you can go out and get some coffee and chat about what you've heard.
Perfect, thank you.